Så jag lämnar över ordet till kvällens värd. Lars, varsågod.
Tack Martin. Även jag vill säga välkomna hit. Roligt att se så många samlade till det här seminariet där vi alltså aktualiserar en av vårt samhälles stora utmaningar just nu, utan tvekan. Den våldsbejakande extremismen och dess effekter för Europa och för vårt land, inte minst Sverige. Vi ska rikta fokus speciellt mot det växande problemet med utländska stridande eller återvändande jihadister. Det vill säga de medborgare runt om i Europa som väljer att ansluta sig till extrema organisationer som exempelvis Islamiska Staten och efter en tid sen återvänder till sina hemländer i Europa med en radikaliserad syn på islam och med direkt erfarenhet av terrorhandlingar. Men jag skulle vilja inleda med några korta reflektioner om situationen i Mellanöstern. Tillsammans med Robert Halef som är kristdemokratisk riksdagsledamot och Martin Kjellstrand som ni mötte här och Charlie Weimers som är mina medarbetare, så besökte jag Irak för lite drygt en vecka sedan. I den kurdiska delen, i kurdiska Irak, KRG, norra Irak, så träffade vi företrädare för provinsregeringen. Vi träffade de politiska partierna, kyrkoledare. Vi hade också möjlighet att möta hjälparbetare och se situationen i ett antal flyktingläger. Allt i syfte då att få en bild av och en uppfattning om konsekvenserna av Islamiska statens brutala framfart. Två budskap kan man säga återkom i alla de samtal som vi hade i Irak. Den humanitära situationen är alarmerande med 300 000 flyktingar ifrån Syrien och ungefär 1,5 miljon interna flyktingar från Irak. Som kommer från olika delar av Irak alltså. Med den situationen så är behovet nu av stöd utifrån av naturliga skäl mycket stort. Det var det ena. Det andra som återkom i våra samtal handlar om den militära situationen. Kampen mot Islamiska Staten är långt ifrån över. Trots viktiga framgångar för den kurdiska peshmerga-armén som ju gör storartade insatser. Trots det så kontrollerar Islamiska Staten idag ett landområde där det bor ungefär 8 miljoner människor. Så ytterligare åtgärder i den här situationen är nödvändiga. Från det internationella samfundets sida naturligtvis, men också på det nationella planet i Irak. Några punkter lyftes särskilt fram i de här samtalen. För det första så stryker man under att sunni-arabernas hjärtan måste vinnas i den här kampen mot IS. Kurdiska företrädare är övertygade om att den strategiskt ju väldigt viktiga staden Mosul inte kommer att kunna befrias med mindre än att sunnimuslimska ledare och soldater finns med i en sån operation. För det andra så måste Iraks centralregering bli mer funktionell och mer samarbetsinriktad. Konstitutionen och minoriteternas rättigheter inte minst måste respekteras. Diskrimineringen av sunniterna som vi har sett på senare år måste stoppas. För det tredje måste den internationella koalitionen mot IS förstärkas. I kampen för att rädda människoliv, i kampen för att stoppa etnisk rensning som det här handlar om, så krävs det att fler länder sluter upp bakom den internationella USA-ledda koalitionen som just nu kämpar mot IS. Och jag vill säga, jag tycker att även Sverige borde finnas med här på ett mer aktivt sätt. Inrikesministern i Kurdistans provinsregering, Abdul Karim Sinjari, sa så här när vi mötte honom. The Peshmergas are fighting IS on behalf of the free world. If you don't help us fighting them here, you will have to fight them in your own countries. Den islamistiska extremismen är inte någon annans angelägenhet. Den är allas vår angelägenhet. När IS hotar med slakt på västvärldens gator och uppmanar sina sympatisörer runt om i världen att verkställa hotet, är det en varningssignal till oss alla. En varningssignal är det också att personerna som genomförde terrorattackerna i Paris hade radikaliserats och tränats i Mellanöstern. Så var det även i de nyligen avslöjade terrorcellerna i Belgien och Tyskland. Där fanns terrortränare, återvändare från Syrien. De europeiska säkerhetstjänsterna har under längre tid pekat ut just återvändande jihadister som det största hotet mot allas vår säkerhet i Europa. Enligt svenska Säpo kan uppemot 300 personer ha lämnat vårt land för att ansluta sig till IS eller andra terrorgrupper. Ett 80-tal av dem har återvänt och finns just nu i Sverige. Vissa av dem med både vilja och förmåga till eller att begå terrorhandlingar här. Trots detta så är det först på senare tid, efter det senaste årets händelser och inte minst efter händelserna i Paris, som vi i Sverige har tagit till oss av den här problematiken. Det är ingen tvekan om att det krävs åtgärder av olika slag, och jag vill verkligen understryka det, av olika slag för att förebygga terrordåd, för att förhindra att fler ansluter sig till Mellanösterns terrorgrupper. Samtidigt så är vi i Sverige tyvärr på efterkälken. Runt om i Europa så har den här debatten kommit längre. Lagstiftning och beslutsfattande har också kommit längre. Några exempel. I Danmark riskerar de som ansluter sig till IS nu att åtalas för landsförräderi. Norge, där riskerar personer som ansluter sig till terrorgrupper 6 års fängelse. I Belgien har sociala myndigheter rätt att dra in beviljade bidrag till återvändande islamister. I Tyskland och i Nederländerna kan passen dras in. I Storbritannien kan såväl pass som medborgarskap återkallas. Den brittiska regeringen, jag hade ett samtal tidigare idag med Storbritanniens ambassadör här i Stockholm och vi kom in på de här frågorna. Och han hänvisade just till att den brittiska regeringen talar väldigt tydligt idag om att ett medborgarskap innebär rättigheter men också skyldigheter. Personer som ansluter sig till en terrororganisation uppfyller inte sina skyldigheter enligt det här resonemanget. De gör ett medvetet val som ju i grund och botten står i strid med med de värderingar som våra samhällen vilar på, nämligen demokrati och människovärde. Jag tror att det för svensk del finns lärdomar att hämta, naturligtvis i vår egen erfarenhet på senare år, men också ifrån våra europeiska grannar just nu. Utredningen som regeringen har tillsatt alldeles nyligen för att se över möjligheterna till kriminalisering och skärpt lagstiftning, det är naturligtvis ett väldigt viktigt steg. Det är också tillsättandet av den särskilda utredaren Mona Sahlin när det gäller våldsbejakande extremism och förbättrat stöd för från myndigheter och civilsamhälle. Men jag vill säga, jag tror inte att detta räcker. Attackerna i Paris, avslöjanden av terrorcellerna i Belgien och Tyskland visar att hotbilden är allvarlig och den är verklig. Skärpt lagstiftning, förebyggande insatser bör därför kompletteras med åtgärder som syftar till att försvåra själva genomförandet av jihadresor. Det här bör ske genom ökat polissamarbete inom EU, effektivare informationsutbyte mellan EUs länder. Det bör också ske genom att de passageraruppgifter som idag lagras hos flygbolagen görs tillgängliga för polis, för säkerhetstjänster via en europeisk lagstiftning, European Passenger Name Record, det som har diskuterats en del på sistone. Men det kan också ske genom att temporärt beslagta pass och återkalla medborgarskap för dubbla medborgare. Det här är ju, det ska vi erkänna, det är långtgående åtgärder. Och innan beslut kan fattas kring det här så behövs det ytterligare utredning. För att belysa de juridiska aspekterna och för att också se till så att det finns en överensstämmelse mellan sådana här åtgärder och de internationella konventioner som vi har undertecknat. Samtidigt så vore det i den situation som vi upplever idag oklokt, tror jag, att utesluta vissa åtgärder som vi ser fungerar i andra delar av Europa. På DN Debatt skriver jag därför idag att regeringen utöver den här utredningen om kriminalisering av terrorresor och terrorträning borde utreda medborgarskapsfrågan. Avslutningsvis, häromdagen såg jag att någon av mina parlamentarikerkollegor i Bryssel sa att man aldrig ska debattera åtgärder, politiska åtgärder, direkt efter en omvälvande och dramatisk händelse. Det är viktigt att inte låta känslorna och oron efter terrorattackerna i Paris ta över i den debatt som vi nu för. Det är viktigt alltid och i alla lägen att värna rättssäkerheten och den personliga integriteten i brottsbekämpningen. Så är det. Men direkt konfronterade av systemhotade brottslighet, direkt utmanade av en militant islamism, så tror jag att det sämsta av alla alternativ i den här situationen är att inte göra någonting, att luta sig tillbaka. Det är om något, som jag ser det, att svika sitt samhällsansvar. That brings us to the next point in our seminar and to our next speaker. It's an honor for me to introduce one of actually the world's leading experts on radicalization and jihadism. Presently, he is a senior research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, where he is working on an intellectual history of Al-Qaeda. Before that, Mr. Maher was a senior fellow at the Policy Exchange, where he worked on foreign policy and security. A number of his policy recommendations, by the way, about how to address theoretical and practical problems with aspects of the existing counter-terrorist policy have been adopted by the British government. And having been a part of radical Islam himself, and being one of, I would say, few able to establish regular contact with jihadists from Syria and from Iraq, he is one of the most knowledgeable researchers when it comes to the motives of European citizens that have joined the Islamic states. So, dear friends, please welcome Shiraz Maher. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Lars, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time here. Before I talk more substantively about Syria and Iraq and the foreign fighters who are going out there, I figured I should probably tell you a little bit about myself. Back, almost 14 years ago now, in the immediate aftermath of September the 11th, I became radicalized. I was a secular, pretty much non-practicing, not very religious Muslim at all, but was radicalized very quickly after those events and joined a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is to a lesser extent known in sort of around Europe. But ultimately, Hizb ut-Tahrir, it means the Party of Liberation. It's a transnational Islamist movement that wants to establish a global caliphate of the type you've seen emerge right now in parts of Iraq and Syria. And that was very much part of the agenda of what we were trying to put together back in those days as well. Then in 2005, so after 4 years of being a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, I resigned from the organization as a matter of conscience. I no longer believed in it, and I disagreed pretty vehemently with it. And then in the coming years, slowly a movement emerged within the UK of sort of former radicals, and it's been formalized, I suppose, and sort of crystallized into something called the Quilliam Foundation. But there are lots of us now out there who are challenging this narrative, and I'll come back to speak about some of that, but challenging very much the views that we once helped spread, and challenging the individuals that we once helped radicalize. By the way, if you see me looking at my phone, it's just because my notes are on it. I'm not tweeting or anything and stuff. But as the conflict then began to arise in Syria and Iraq, I became very, very interested in this. And it's interesting, I was speaking the other day with a friend of mine, Majid Nawaz, who again some of you in the room are probably familiar with. So he was another member of Hizb ut-Tahrir who spent 4 years imprisoned by Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and was tortured out there. And we were saying how, in fact, that we had been part of a sort of earlier generation, half a generation younger, that we had been sort of caught up in that post 9/11 momentum. But had we been younger now, we'd have probably not joined Hizb ut-Tahrir, but we'd be in Syria and Iraq as members of Islamic State. So when we talk about these individuals, we sort of say, look, we understand their mindset, we understand what the attraction is, we understand what motivates people to go. In my professional capacity, at least at King's College London, I've utilized a lot of my knowledge of Islamic and jihadi theology in order to build relationships with fighters out in Syria. I talk to them on Skype, I talk to them through smartphone applications, in order to build a relationship to gain an empirical insight, again, through building relations with them about why they're going, what they hope to achieve, what their experiences are like, and what their thoughts are on the West and the potential for returning. So if I start with, why are people going out there? The important thing to note with Syria is it's caught the public imagination now. We're sat here talking about this event in the aftermath of what's happened in Paris, and we've had similar attacks in Canada and in Australia. But the Syrian conflict, of course, started in 2011, and it began as a result of the government cracking down on the legitimate rights of the people and cracking down in the most brutal and tyrannical fashion against what was a legitimate and popular uprising that was peaceful by the Syrian people. And as that situation slipped into greater chaos and the Syrian indigenous response began to mobilize itself in terms of militarily defending itself against the regime, there were people from Britain and from across Europe who decided that they felt a concern about the humanitarian suffering in that country. Now, because they were Muslim, they chose to identify with the Syrian people and wanted to help them in the sense of going there and serving as jihadists. And that's the thing that differentiated them from their fellow citizens who were non-Muslims in Europe, who were similarly watching the same things that were taking place and who were similarly appalled. You didn't have to be a Muslim to be appalled at what the Syrian regime was doing or to be outraged. And what was very interesting in those early stages, and when I'm saying really early on, I'm talking here about people who were going in the latter parts of 2012 and at the start of 2013. So we're talking about some time back now. But for them, this was not a morally ambiguous thing to do, to go to Syria to fight. It didn't strike them as a legally ambiguous thing to do either, because as far as they were concerned, this was in line with the stated aims of the White House, of Whitehall, of the British government, that we had said, and as a number of European governments did as well, that the Assad regime was illegitimate, that its time had come for it to move on and for there to be a transition. So in the early contact I had with these guys, they were saying, look, well, why are we being discussed and talked about in the context of counter-terror legislation? Why are we being talked about and considered in this way? We're heroes. We're here to help the people, and we're sort of broadly in line with what the sort of foreign policy or stated aims of our own governments are. And so it's a very, very different act in their minds to those who went to Iraq or who went to Afghanistan when coalition troops were there, because they were like, we're not fighting our home country or its allies. So there was a sense of a confusion in those early stages. Now, since that time, the situation on the ground has changed dramatically, the nature of the groups has changed dramatically, and therefore the nature of the individual who goes has also changed in line with that. And I'll come back to explain why these distinctions are important. But now it's quite clear that the only show in town, the only group that really is in the ascendancy and that anyone talks about, is Islamic State. It is the most powerful and seductive movement on the ground to these young men. Individuals who go today are not going principally in their minds to defend the people or operating on a humanitarian basis. They're going principally because they are ideologically invested in the notion of what Islamic State stands for, because they want to be part of that project, because they want to further that project, and ultimately to serve its aims. So they are going from a much more vigorous and invested and zealous ideological starting point. There's two other categories of people we sort of we have a typology of fighters who are going at Syria. So they say the sort of humanitarian, sort of jihadi sympathizer who went at the start, whose principal concern was people and overthrowing the regime, and that was really it. The second is what we call the martyrdom seeker. These are people for whom they believe that to die in Syria is to achieve paradise immediately and instantaneously. And so for them, the primary aim is to go to Syria and to die. And then you have, to a large extent, for a number of people as well, they're just adventure seekers. They are attracted to this. Their friends have gone. We have a report coming out very shortly, in fact, which talks about this fact. If you look at the structure of who's going and the manner in which they're going out to Syria, it's still people, yes, they're being radicalized by the internet, but still people who have connections, still friends of friends. And you can see that, I believe it's the same is true in Sweden, it's the same across Europe, it's the same in the UK, that if you find one individual who goes, then his friends go. The 5 people around him who are closest to him will go, and then the 4 people who are close to them will go. So it's still these real world clusters, and they matter a great deal. And this is why you see concentrations in certain towns and in certain places that don't necessarily stand out in and of themselves. It's just that someone happened to go from there by random chance, and as a result, that's become a dynamic spot. So in Britain, for example, we know traditionally, of course, London's an important town, Birmingham's an important town, Manchester, but Portsmouth has become very important in the Syrian context. And this is a cluster that I've spent a lot of time with. I've spoken to these individuals before they all died. It's purely random. It's by chance that one individual from that town went, and then he arranged for 6 of his friends to come, and then they arranged for others to come. And so it's a pure chance episode. And as I say, a lot of them motivated by that sense of adventure. And then the final category is the known radical, someone who's had a long-standing history of radical associations, who's been engaging in this kind of activity for quite some time back in the West, and for whom Syria presents the opportunity now to finally realize the aims of what they want to achieve and do. It's also worth pointing out that in terms of having an indigenous Muslim community response to that conflict, and in terms of trying to dissuade people from going, well, again, as the timeline has shifted, so too have the ability for those narratives to exist. At the start, it was very difficult for imams and for community workers to have a strong narrative against the tyranny and oppression of the Assad regime. Again, if we go back to 2012, it's very difficult to say, well, Assad's got a point of view. He doesn't. But today, in the context of Islamic State, it's very easy now for people to come out and to condemn that organization, to condemn its nihilism, its brutality, and for counter-narratives that are theologically based, that exist within a religious tradition to come forward from, as I say, imams and other community activists who want to form counter-narratives on that basis. But they don't have to be. There are political counter-narratives too. In 2012, people had a very romantic vision about the Arab uprisings, and they thought they could go to Syria and that it would be like capturing Gaddafi in Libya, and that they would be hailed as heroes and so on. In fact, what we've seen in Syria and Iraq is the degeneration of this conflict, not just into an incredibly brutalized conflict, but also one that's been very fratricidal, where these groups are fighting each other, and they are fighting one another on the basis of a turf war. So one guy from London might go and by complete chance end up joining Islamic State, and the other guy ends up by complete chance joining Ahrar al-Sham, and they may have lived a street apart, and now they're killing each other for what is essentially a gang war and a turf war in this context. So what are some of the responses to this that have come about? Again, I'm going to speak a lot about the British experience. Some of the lessons are probably relevant here as well. Part of it has been that attempt to put in a counter-narrative, and the government, I think, has done two things. One is that it's taken this strong legislative approach, which is to try to sort of use a carrot and a stick, essentially. On the one hand, it's saying, look, if you go to Syria, there's a potential for you to be thrown into prison for the rest of your life if you come back, which I don't think was a particularly smart approach for them to have taken, but that's certainly one of the things that they said. The other things they've done is to revoke passports. And the revocation of passports has proved pretty successful in stopping people from traveling. And so a few months ago, it was announced that border agencies and border guards would be given increased powers to strip passports of people at the port of exit, which they didn't previously have. And so there were cases where the authorities were saying, look, we know that this group of 5 guys, 6 guys are about to go off and but we don't have the power at the port to strip them of their passport and to prevent travel. It's not illegal to buy a plane ticket to Turkey. So they've been given increased powers now to do that. And that, of course, at least in the British context, is a tried and tested method. It's been used for years on English football hooligans, which, being Europeans, you'll be very familiar with them, but very successful in stopping British football hooligans from traveling to the continent before tournaments in order to try and deflate the potential for violence in those contexts. It's worth pointing out in Canada, however, that the attacks perpetrated there were done by failed travelers. And so failed travelers, just because you've denied them the opportunity to leave your country, definitely need to be watched very, very closely indeed, because they're not suddenly going to disengage from the enterprise in which they attempted to engage with. So failed travelers are very important. The other thing which is slightly more controversial in the British context, and I think in a more sort of generally humanitarian context, is the revocation of citizenship. And again, the British government has done that in a number of cases where it has revoked the citizenship of individuals who've gone out to Syria to fight. It has not always done that in cases where individuals have dual citizenship either. It has done that in cases where it just believes you have the potential to acquire a secondary citizenship should you seek it out. So they have effectively made people stateless, as I say. I think it's legally ambiguous, but also morally ambiguous, particularly in Europe, as we understand some of the context around that. I don't think it's the right thing to do. And put the historical resonances aside, look at the broader implications of this. This is exactly, essentially what happened with the emergence of Al-Qaeda as a result of the 1980s and the experience of the Afghan Mujahideen in the Soviet Union. When they finished fighting there at the end of the 1980s, a lot of these fighters attempted to go home. And instead of going home, what they realized was to their normal lives or to whatever else they wanted to do, they realized that to go home was to mean being thrown into prison and to be tortured. And so they decided they wouldn't do that. So they regrouped, of course, in Sudan. And when you make these people effectively stateless, they have to find a purpose to their lives. They have to find a cause for the rest of their existence, essentially. And that gives rise to and fuels the millenarianism of many of these groups and the radicalism of many of these individuals. And so again, for us to deny these individuals citizenship is to essentially displace a problem into Syria and Iraq that will grow and build for many, many years. And as we saw on September the 11th, the potential for these things to come back later on, years down the line, and to affect you at home is still a very, very real possibility. So to just cancel someone's citizenship or to revoke it, to think you've pulled up the drawbridge and you've excluded them is not a particularly intelligent strategy. In fact, as I said, there are the timeline of individuals who goes, the different types of individual who goes, means there's different types of individuals who return. So again, we've created a typology here. We believe that there is an individual who comes back who is dangerous. And the individual who is dangerous needs to be dealt with through the criminal justice system. They need to be prosecuted and sent to prison. And clearly, there will be returnees who will pose that kind of threat. There are also returnees who will be deranged. And what we mean by that, essentially, is that you have to bear in mind and appreciate that lots of people going out to Syria and Iraq are very, very young individuals. They are given no formal training and have no psychological support, and a lot of them suffer from combat stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, if they return home, the best agency to probably deal with them is public health, not the police necessarily. But again, an assessment needs to be made. And then you have the disillusioned, individuals who have been out there, who were swept up in the glory of what they believe to be this romantic struggle, who will return, who will say, you know, actually, I spent a year in Raqqa, I spent some time with Islamic State, I know what it's like. And I think there's probably no more seductive or powerful counter-narrative than that disillusioned voice who's going to come back and be able to give you that testimony. And they're a potential asset that can be worked with. So again, there needs to be a pragmatic approach here. And the British government's response, as I say, despite this hard-line legislative approach which has dominated the media discourse around a lot of this, it's certainly the case as well that they are applying that law pragmatically and that they are not applying it in every case. There are 260 returnees in the UK. About 50 are involved in the criminal justice system. So you're talking about 200 people back in the UK who are not being prosecuted. Now, clearly in some cases, that's just because there isn't enough evidence against them and there's an evidential problem. But in other cases, it's because they've chosen to make a pragmatic decision about what you do with these individuals. And that's important to note. Then I'm just going to wrap up quickly by talking about the other side of this, which is I think Britain is unique from its European counterparts insofar as it does have now a civil society response, and Britain has been very strong in trying to generate and engineer from the grassroots a civil society response to the extremist threat. So this goes hand in hand with and complements the stronger legislative side of this, and this focuses on prevention, both in terms of de-radicalization and disengagement. So what is that civil society response? That civil society response isn't just Muslim community-led, but it involves all of society as a whole. It's a values-led engagement. It says, what do we as a society fundamentally believe in? And how can we best project and promote our values collectively and inclusively for everybody around a sort of shared set of ideals that we can all strive towards? So as I say, you have institutions now like the Quilliam Foundation, but for a long time they were the only one that you could talk about. And so you could say, oh, well, this is just one thing, and the radicals would say, well, they're stooges. But now, if you look at how many different groups there are out there doing this similar type of work, British Muslims for Secular Democracy, another group. Sarah Khan runs a group called Inspire, very, very important. The Dean Institute, another one, very important. So there are multiple groups on the ground now doing active grassroots engagement from a Muslim community perspective, but then, as I say, complemented by and supported by a whole range of non-Muslim civil society groups that are also there saying, look, these are the fundamental values of what we believe in as a country and as a state. You can be part of it. Let's build it together, and to actively seek to build people and tie them into the state in that way. And ultimately, of course, no one attacks what they believe they're a part of. When Mohammed Sadiq Khan launched the 7/7 London terrorist attacks, he spoke about my people in reference to Iraqis that he'd never met, in reference to a country he'd never been to, and in relation to his fellow citizens that he was killing. That's the most important thing here, is to tie people into the state through that civil society engagement, which makes them a part of their home countries and makes them feel there. And as I say, then they don't attack which they're part of. I'll end with this. If you take the journey of all the ex-Islamists in the UK, we all got involved in radical Islam for very different reasons. Myself and Majid, I think it's fair to say, were more interested in the politics of it than the religious side of it. Other people we know and are friends with were very religious, they still are very religious, and got involved for religious reasons. So you can't put all our stories in one sort of fundamental way and say, oh, well, here it is, here's the model. But you can boil down certain shared commonalities. And one of the most important ones I come back to constantly is that sense early on of an identity conflict. Where do we stand in our society? What's our role? And in that context of not being unsure, something like Islamism, radical Islam, is a very, very seductive ideology because it tells you, look, it doesn't matter if you're British or you're Pakistani. It doesn't matter if you're this or you're that. You're part of something greater than all of that. You're a Muslim. And that's an identity that transcends culture. It transcends geography. It's supercultural. It's an intellectual identity. And you know what? It's 1.5 billion strong. And today, if you're recruiting for Islamic State, you'd say, and we're winning. We're not just this sort of metaphorically strong power, we're winning. We've got a caliphate. It's there. It's standing in Iraq and Syria. It's taking land. So why aren't you part of it? And we need to have, as I say, a robust, muscular, liberal response to that in order to be able to rebut it. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shiraz, for outstanding analysis. Very interesting to listen to you, and thank you also for sharing your personal experiences and insights. I think that's really important to hear. Before open up the floor for remarks and questions, I just want to follow up on this personal side of your story. You were, as I understand, a well-integrated student in UK when you decided to join this extremist organization. And I think it's interesting to hear a little bit more how you ended up in this organization and what made you finally take the decision to be a member. Nowadays, I think there are many different explanations why young men, especially, decide to join these organizations. But could you tell us a little bit more about your experience?
Sure. So in my own case, I'd grown up. It was my own upbringing was slightly unusual in that I wasn't brought up in the UK. I was brought up in Saudi Arabia, and there was a lot of anti-Americanism prevalent there, particularly with regards to the Middle East conflict, but also in the Saudi context after the Gulf War, when the US came to Saudi, and there was a big debate about whether the United States should be allowed to have military bases on what was perceived to be holy soil and so on.
Right.
So there was a lot of anti-Americanism. I was quite young when that happened, and so it didn't really matter a great deal to me, that debate per se, but it was definitely the sort of background of my upbringing that the United States is a hostile power towards Muslims. So when September the 11th happened, to my mind at the time, I was like, well, this is blowback. This is the kind of repercussions of this involvement in the Middle East. But that didn't motivate me per se to get involved. What was very interesting to me was a few days later when it turned out that 15 of the hijackers were Saudi. And I thought, well, this is a country I understand. And people even today misunderstand Saudi, but back in 2001, nobody had any understanding at all of Saudi Arabia. So I thought, well, here's a country I understand. I've lived there. I'd lived there for 14 years before I moved. And so I was very, very naive about Islam. Didn't really know anything about it. I thought, let me go to the mosque and find out what people are saying about this. Does Islam justify, what happened? And so I met, by chance, at the mosque, some members of Hizb ut-Tahrir who were very interesting, very intelligent, and they offer a panacea. And that's what young men fundamentally want. You want a panacea to the world's problems, a one-size-fits-all solution. And so the idea, that we will unite the world's Muslims and that we'll all be sort of euphorically happy with this and all accepting of it, and all the problems will suddenly dissipate. It sounds ridiculous now, but it made sense at the time. And it was very interesting because the guy I spoke with who recruited me in, I said to him, does Islam justify what happened on September 11th? And he never answered the question. He said, well, it's happened now. What really matters now is that America will use this event as an opportunity to prosecute a war on Islam, to persecute Muslims. And, and that sort of A chimed with what I was thinking. And B, unfortunately, the rhetoric of the Bush administration was playing into that as well, saying you're with us or you're against us. I said, well, I'm not with you. So if the only other option is now to be against you, then I have to be against you. And so you had this one lot of rhetoric coming out from there. And then And then, as I say, the radicals. And the final point I make on it is this. You know, I was 20 when this happened, or 21. You honestly believed at the time that you were on the cusp of new history, that something radical was going to change in the world, and that something new and profound would come up, this caliphate. And this is what I said when I said, like, my experience with Majid and with some of the others who have also left the radical Islam behind now, is that sense of wanting to be part of new history, wanting to be part of this wave of sort of redefining the world and stuff. Well, we weren't even taking up arms and fighting. We were just, you know, giving radical speeches around London. But now, if you're a young man who's 20 and you feel like that and you want to be on the cusp of history, well, history is being made right now in the Middle East. And as far as they're concerned, the caliphate is back. So why would you not go there and be part of it?